Hey, what's good? Believe it or not, but I've never played a main series Pokemon game. That doesn't mean I'm unfamiliar with Pokemon, in fact, far from it. I've been a collector of the TCG since the early days, and I loved Pokemon Stadium 2 on the Nintendo 64. With all that being said, I've never played any of the games that made millions fall in love with the brand, and as such, here are my thoughts after putting 100 hours into Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Everyone seems to love absolutely demolishing the graphics, and I'm not going to fight an uphill battle trying to justify why this game looks like a Pac-Man arcade machine could run it. The graphics are straight garbo. In handheld mode, they look passable, obviously because of how tiny the Switch screen is compared to modern TVs. For everyone saying it's not Game Freak's fault, and rather the Switch hardware is incapable of handling a game that looks worse than Pokemon Go, I counter with how the creator of Paldea looks. There's no excuse other than greed and lack of effort for why the game couldn't look at least that good and not like my microwave could run it while heating up Thanksgiving leftovers. What a shame that despite its potential, Game Freak refused to make this a polished experience and is still stuck making monster catchers that would not have been hits 20 years ago. Seriously, go check out Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch. The game is like 13 years old and made by Level 5, who has nowhere near the budget of Game Freak, and you're telling me 13 years later, Pokemon is only now imitating some of the mechanics, and poorly at that? That's just one example of how Game Freak keeps wasting the luxury of having the biggest franchise at their disposal. Aside from its fans, I doubt anyone knows about Ni no Kuni or Monster Hunter, let alone would say the games are designed far better than any Pokemon games, and yet that's the reality. I put in 100 hours into Violet because I like Monster Hunters in general, and Pokemon gives me nostalgia. But if I didn't have friends to play it with, I would never pay full price for this game. Apparently, co-op multiplayer is totally new to the main games, and I have to say, overall, I love it. I have mixed feelings on the implementation, as you can join a friend's game but will be unable to catch version exclusives unless the player whose world you joined is also nearby in game. Yeah, it forces you to do some co-op, but it also takes away from the open world Game Freak tried to make this game into. It's also super frustrating that you have to connect to online every single time you start the game up, as not only is it tedious and counterintuitive to anyone who's played a video game in the last decade, but it also resets raids once you connect. Why would the game generate a 4-star raid and then the second you interact with the crystal to start it and want to let others join you, you have to back out, connect to online services, and soon as you connect, the raid crystals disappear? Speaking of the raid mechanic, here's another gimmick that feels unpolished. The raids truly aren't difficult enough to make them worth doing over and over, especially if you already have the Pokemon from the raid. I don't know if shiny or perfect IV chances are better, but beyond that being the case, there's little to no incentive to do them in large numbers. The Terra Shards are nice, and they allow you to change the Terra type of your Pokemon, and you also get materials for making TMs, but all of that can also be collected in the overworld by simple exploration. As someone who put a lot of time into Pokemon Go, this just feels like a step back, especially since the terastallization gimmick isn't impressive either. The gimmicks in general are just a fresh coat of paint on a corroding heap of metal junk. Terastallization is possible due to the unique crystals available in Paldea, and it just powers up your Pokemon and changes whatever typing it has into a different single type, in the process also making any moves that Pokemon has of that type significantly stronger. The appearance of the Pokemon stays the same, except that it gets engulfed in crystals and grows a ridiculous crystal hat, which signals what its Terra type is. You also get the ability to use terastallization very early into the game, and it's never expanded upon. It's not a fleshed out mechanic where you have to learn to use it correctly to advance. In fact, the battles use the same old formula and don't go beyond knowing your typing matchups. There's a few areas where you use your Pokemon to battle other Pokemon in a sort of real-time battle royale manner, but it isn't challenging in the least bit. My favorite mechanic, and the only one I can speak fondly of, is having the box cover legendary be your means of transportation. Doing the Path of Legends storyline powers the legendary up, giving them new abilities in the process, which helps with getting around Paldea. It's a necessity for completing the Pokédex, but I wish it led to some extra content in terms of maybe hidden items you could reach or the such, especially if they're shifting the series into an open world design. The new Pokemon designs don't look like they follow any theme or guidelines. They're very much all over the place, and unless you stick with the game to the end, you're unlikely to find Pokemon that will resonate with you. That was the case for me. Initially, I thought the designs were weak, and up until 40 or 50 hours into the game, I had only caught 2 or 3 Pokemon I really liked. Now that I've nearly completed the Pokédex, I feel confident in saying that there's some amazing designs and typing choices in Gen 9. My top 3 absolute favorites are the Glamet Glamora line, Wo-Chien, and the Smoliv Dolive Arboliva line. But I also like Palafin, Flamigo, Baxcalibur, Orthworm, Toedscruel, and Mousehold. Some Pokemon like Toedscruel or Mousehold or Scovillain feel like their sole reason for existence is to be a pun, but it also works, so no harm in that, I suppose. The Paradox Pokemon, which are either ancient or futuristic forms of Pokemon depending on which version of the game you get, are also well designed and probably a good indication of the future of the entire brand. Why design totally new Pokemon when you can alter existing designs, make them great, and explain it away with the story? The story itself is also very good. The dialogue and character designs are very childish, and you can tell the developers are trying to keep up with the times and seem cool to the kids whom this game is mostly intended for. I wouldn't have minded that choice if it didn't interfere with the darker plot points, especially towards the end of the game. It was heartfelt and funny, but also dark and unnecessarily became more and more outrageous as you progressed through it. It harshly fell into the JRPG trope where everything is constantly being one-upped, and although your first task isn't finding an egg in the chicken coop and your last task isn't destroying the universe, it starts to feel like that towards the end. A few years ago, I played through Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth Hacker's Memory, and despite its horrendous name, I thought it was a great game for a competing franchise that doesn't have the recognition or popularity of Pokemon. The ending of Violet gave me strong Cyber Sleuth vibes both visually and thematically, except Digimon stayed consistent with those creative choices throughout the game, and in Pokemon Violet, it comes off a bit out of left field and feels unoriginal and stolen. The actual performance of the game leaves much to be desired as well. There wasn't a single day that I played without running into major frame rate drops. Unlike my friends, the game never crashed for me, but I'm tossing that up to sheer luck. It's infuriating that you cannot explore entire areas of the open world without the game trying its best to crash. Lake Casseroya is probably the worst area, obviously because of the water, but that doesn't explain the frame rate issues in all the other areas that are graphically nowhere near as demanding. The glitches likewise make no sense. I've seen some of the crazier ones all over the internet, and luckily I didn't experience any of those, but I can't count all the times that Pokemon spawn inside of walls or beyond the playable area of the game, or straight up despawned when I got near them. Likewise, just controlling your character isn't very fun or smooth. Everything feels delayed, and even 100 hours in, I can't figure out whether it's a design choice to compensate for poor performance and let the game catch up by slowing down user input reactions, or if it's just the game struggling to run. Either way, it's inexcusable. Maybe 20 some years ago, the speed of battles was acceptable, but in 2022, it cannot take 30 seconds to make a single move within such a simple battle system. I wonder how many of the game's issues can be attributed to the speed at which modern humans are accustomed to living their lives. I wonder how much of it can be attributed to me not being a child and having hundreds of hours of free time to put into the game. I don't think it's a good choice to make shiny Pokemon so rare to come by, but maybe that's just my age showing and not the reality of the game's shortcomings? I don't know. But either way, I have this shiny Murkrow and Salazzle. Don't at me, bro. Speaking of which, the dialogue is so cringy. It's so cringe that I'm being cringe just to describe its cringiness. Some gym leaders are DJs, some are Twitch streamers, there's random 60-year-old sous chef trainers talking about pro wrestling. I swear I'm not losing my mind, but Game Freak might be. What makes it even worse is that there's like 4 character skins used for all the characters in the game, so half the time I thought I was talking to someone I've already met before, just to find out they're a totally new random NPC that's just as ridiculous and nonsensical as the one I was confusing them for. Going in, I assumed the greatest obstacle for me would be learning the typings of the Pokemon and their weaknesses and resistances. The TCG is much more simplified as not all the types appear in the TCG, but because of that, the real types of Pokemon are often completely off in the trading card game. Wheezing and Coughing, for example, usually appear as Grass type or Psychic type Pokemon, even though neither of those are their actual types. I'm kind of disappointed that with my playstyle this wasn't really an issue, since I just caught my favorite Gen 8 Pokemon, Dragapult, and overpowered him to the point where I essentially beat the game using just one Pokemon. Maybe that's not the proper way to play, but I'd argue it's incentivized with the overall world design. You're encouraged to go out and play the game your way, focusing on whatever you want. Although I appreciate the freedom to do that, it's ruined by the fact that nothing actually scales with your Pokemon's levels. If you want to train a level 5 Lechonk up to level 90 and then start your journey taking on the most difficult gym first, that's your prerogative. But if you decide to end on what should have been the first gym you defeat, don't expect that gym to give you any resistance, as you'll still fight level 8 Pokemon. There's 3 paths or storylines you have to complete before you can beat the game, and although each one is unique and you're given the option to tackle them any which way you like, it only makes sense to tackle them all concurrently. Otherwise, you end up in a situation like me, where you're trying to rush the very last storyline, which in my case was Starfall Street, just to get to the final area of the game. It feels totally half-baked and like it wasn't even designed with the open world concept in mind. Horizon Forbidden West plays out much the same way, but following the options branching out, it comes together for a much larger part of the whole story, not forcing the player to rush through anything just for the sake of progression. Likewise, Horizon allows for new abilities to aid in exploration outside of important narrative cues, whereas Scarlet and Violet do not. It's not the worst attempt at an open world game, but given how saturated the market is with sandbox games, it's totally lackluster. My last point to touch on is that I don't intend to do any competitive play with Pokemon. I didn't buy this with the intention of battling outside of my friends and outside of the single player portion of the game. I'm sure plenty of players will want to optimize their Pokemon for just that, and perhaps that adds more value to this game than the value I got out of it. But I find some of the menus and technical aspects of battling and just displaying Pokemon data to be lacking. There's so much that's hidden or really can only be inferred from external sources or by people familiar with past games. I don't care enough for that aspect of the game to draw me in, but then again, I don't know that if I did, it would change my opinions of the game overall. There's a ton to do regardless, and much of it requires the player to explore the world on their own and talk to NPCs. It's actually rewarding to see a game that doesn't hold the player's hand at every turn. The classes at the academy are worth taking, and they lead to some side quests and really useful information, but yet are optional. It's a surprising but welcome choice for a game meant to appeal to such a wide audience. All in all, I enjoyed my time with Pokemon Violet, but I can't shake the feeling that this is the tried and true formula of corporate greed. Make a product with major shortcomings, but just enough good to appeal to those buying it for nostalgia, while also robbing blind the parents of those who are the target audience. Is Pokemon Violet a perfect game? Absolutely not. Is it worth $60? Not even close. Am I probably done no-lifing it for the foreseeable future? Definitely. But despite all that, I still enjoyed my time with the game.